Good morning and good afternoon for everyone here in the room. Thank you for joining us here today for our CISO Hour webinar. So this is an hour where we will be talking about some of the bigger trends in 2023 that we've reflected on and a bit of an outlook of what we could probably look forward to in 2024. Some of the things we'll be talking about today are around vulnerability trends, regulator trends, and Gen AI. It won't be just me. I am joined by two colleagues of mine in security. Alice McCracken, who is the product area lead in ANZ for threat intelligence and defensive security, and David Willett, who's a CISO in PEXA. So, David, I might ask you just to do a quick intro and tell us a bit about yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. So I've been with PEXA, or Property Exchange Australia is the full version of that acronym, for about 5 years. So anyone who's not really familiar with PEXA and what we do, so PEXA is Australia's primary e-conveyancing platform. So about 90% of Australia's property transactions, settlements, refinances, mortgages, all happen through our platform. And it's a bit of a world first. So we're one of the only countries that's purely doing lodgement and settlement in this way, and we've started to take that overseas into the UK now as well. I've been in cyber myself for about 15 years. Spent about the bulk of that working in Canberra in managed services, so a bit of a service delivery background, and yeah, been here in Melbourne at PEXA for the last 5.
Thank you. Alice, I might ask you to give us a bit of a background into your experience in cyber.
Yeah, sure. So I've been at ANZ for just over 4 years. Like you said, I lead threat intelligence and offensive security. So that's threat intelligence from your tactical operational all the way up to strategic intelligence. That's very much my bread and butter and what I'm passionate about. And as well as intel, we also do red teaming as well. So that's your offensive security component. Everyone knows ANZ Bank, so I don't need to do a bit of a run through of that one. One of the big 4 banks here in Australia. And yeah, that's sort of the overview, I suppose.
Great, thank you. And for anyone who doesn't know who I am, my name is Shane Ripley. I am the field CISO here in Recorded Future. A lot of my role involves spending time with some of our large global clients and working on their security strategies with them to help sort of shape a more proactive strategy. Previous to Recorded Future, I actually spent a few years in ANZ Bank, and before that I was in the UK government doing intelligence for special operations. So I wanted Alice and David to join me on this as more of just a discussion and reflection points on 2023, especially looking at the predictions coming out of what we can expect in 2024. It's always interesting to sort of look back on what we predicted at the start of 2023 and how wrong and right we were. And it sort of gives us some insights into, where we're going this year. I know some very quick reflections from me was, and we were just having this discussion earlier around Gen AI being one of them, for example. At the start of 2023, everyone thought the world was on fire with Gen AI in the sense of, we're going to be expecting mass exploitation any minute, and it didn't seem to come. Not saying it won't, but it was, an interesting trend that didn't occur. And we'll cover some of that as well. But, 2023 as a whole, and I'll set the sort of scene with some really interesting stats. So INSICT, which is our main research arm here in Recorded Future, they just published their annual 2023 report recently. And that's sort of looking at a whole bunch of market statistics in cybersecurity and pulling out some of the trends and observations from their perspective. Now, some of the things that really stood out to me was, one of them was high-risk vulnerabilities, for example. If we look at how many high-risk vulnerabilities occurred in 2022 versus 2023, we saw a 4x increase, specifically in enterprise software. So there was a 4x increase in enterprise software vulnerabilities, as well as a 4x increase in network infrastructure critical vulnerabilities. So the scale of dealing with vulnerabilities sort of went through the roof. I might actually ask you, David, what did that increase in volume feel like as a CISO who's carries a lot of the risk for dealing with vulnerabilities?
Yeah, look, and I think some of the biggest challenges there is how you go about actually prioritizing what is a vulnerability. You know, we try to look at it beyond just patching software, but what are all of our exposures? What are our pen testings finding? What are our red teams finding? And trying to bring a singular view of all that in so that we know that we're on top of what we are most likely to be exploited by. And I think that's what you've really got to be trying to be focused on, is getting that good singular view. And you know, when it comes to, I mean, I think what we saw, if you think about the amount of 0 days we saw, right? Something like Citrix Bleed or something like that comes out, and immediately it's like, all right, are we impacted by this? Because you can have all the best patching in the world, and I think, you know, to your question, how does that feel as a CISO? It's, well, we're always 0 day away, that there is no protection or mitigation where the exploits are already available from falling into that trap. And that's when your response and recovery testing and your ability to respond and recover is really going to, come in handy. I think I was saying to Alice beforehand, it's a difference between, both are bad, but if you get owned by a 0 day, there's also owning hundreds of other organizations at the same time. It's a bit different if you get owned by a vulnerability that's been sitting on a network server for 6 months that's no one's got around to yet.
No. And what are some of the sort of those initial, Citrix Bleed is a great example. That caused huge amounts of panic for good reasons. What were those initial sort of reactions for you with that? Like the initial considerations, the first thing you do when you hear about some massive critical vulnerability, what are those immediate, actions that you put into place? Or those questions you ask?
Apart from panicking, no, just kidding. No. No, and this is where confidence in your processes and your teams and how well you've tested them really comes into it. So we've got, like a lot of organisations do or should, a team who are dedicated to managing and doing research on vulnerabilities as they come out. They could impact us, and going through that process and following the bouncing ball. From a CISO's perspective, it's really, a lot of it is also making sure that the business and our third parties are comfortable with the fact that we've got it in hand too. Because what happens is it hits the media when a Citrix Bleed or go back to Log4j, and a lot of our bosses now are a little bit more switched on to cybersecurity in the media, and that your processes need to be robust enough so that you can understand what is the impact to you and what is the remediation before panic, essentially, and all hell breaks loose within the organisation or within your third parties, because you start fielding it from left, right and centre, because those connected to you also want to know, hey, are you impacted by this? If you are, have you remediated? If not, when will you remediate? So the number of people who are interested in your response has raised quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. I think most organizations are probably sharing that view as well. Alice, you manage threat intelligence, and I'm sure a big part of what you do is monitor vulnerabilities in some way or another and do that initial assessment. Is this something that you've seen, we see that 4x increase. Have you personally noticed that volume change?
Yeah, absolutely. Our team really keeps an eye on what's happening out there as far as 0 days are getting announced, as proof of concepts are being disclosed. And so we have seen a lot more points where we are escalating to teams. But similar to sort of the question that you asked, as far as the threat intelligence-led approach to how do you actually respond, when you have so many different vulnerabilities, it's then, okay, let's prioritize. And that's where our team really comes in. So we are, like I said, looking to see if there's proof of concepts out there which would suggest widespread exploitation. We're looking to see if there is already exploitation. And then also, what are the patterns with this particular vulnerability where we know that threat actors have exploited this kind in the past? And if so, what can we do to protect ourselves with that knowledge in mind? So quite a few different things that we can apply to help prioritize it, but yeah, we have seen a big increase.
Yeah, and that's actually very useful context information for anyone trying to manage a threat intelligence team, especially. figuring out how to triage and what those steps are, especially looking for proof of concept, for example, it can get very onerous when there's so many coming out. I think the interesting thing for me with exploits, and something that I noticed with the 2023 report, is when I've been speaking to organizations in my current role, not many are aware of the very clean bifurcation in exploitation. What I mean by that, there's a split between exploits. You have unique exploitation and then widespread. Unique is what we saw with CLOP. This is usually one or two threat actors, mostly exploiting an enterprise software vulnerability, which requires a high level of expertise and quite a lot of specialization. And when we look at CLOP, for example, they look at a lot of file transfer vulnerabilities. They then carried on specializing that and looking for other vulnerabilities to sort of carry on with that specialization. So when we look at enterprise software vulnerabilities, it's primarily unique in the sense of it's a handful of threat actors. So for me anyways, that sometimes factors into making risk decisions as to the likelihood of exploitation here. Then when we look at sort of widespread vulnerabilities, these are your network infrastructure vulnerabilities. These are Microsoft vulnerabilities or internet-facing vulnerabilities, and very low skill threshold to exploit them. And for me anyways, having previously worked in the bank and even government, the risk goes way up because anyone can exploit it, and also anyone can scan for that. So understanding those two things when you're dealing with vulnerabilities and risk assessing vulnerabilities, I think is important in your risk decisions and your risk processes. But it's something that's slowly catching on more. And definitely a year ago, it was very rare that someone at a senior level was instantly asking one of those two questions. So that was a key takeaway for me when I went through some of the data. So on the other side of the fence to that, or somewhat related, something I really latched onto that I found fascinating was a 7x increase in Linux vulnerabilities compared to 2022. There was a huge shift in exploitation. So this is offensive tooling and exploits written for Linux, and that was, that wasn't on my radar at the start. So I especially remember looking at the trends, and I actually pulled up a bunch of reports from 2022 predicting 2023 outcomes, and not a single one sort of focused on Linux. So that's pretty interesting for a few reasons. Is that something that, Alice, from a threat intel perspective, is that something that's factoring into your outlook on threat intel this year? Are you spending any more time looking at Linux as a sort of TTP or?
It makes, I suppose in my mind, it makes sense that that's what they're now looking at, as they being the threat actors. We constantly watch them evolve their techniques. As we get better at protecting one system, they'll go after another system. And this is also a great example of these threat actors having a really good understanding, better than ever, of enterprise environments, and they know how valuable those systems are, so that's what they're going to be prioritizing. So from a threat intel's perspective, absolutely, it makes sense that that's the next evolution, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, look, from my perspective, I think it always comes down to two things. It's capability and opportunity. With Linux anyways, when you look at the research, the capability aspect of it, what's really interesting is you see a lot of threat actors using programming languages like Go and Rust. These are Unix, and when you compile it, it's very easy to deploy it in multiple operating systems. So capability means, okay, it's much easier to deploy Linux malware. And then you look at opportunity, I think a lot of advanced groups are very quickly realizing that often in Linux environments there are excessive privileges. There's a lot of sensitive data, especially with the push towards virtualization, so opportunities increased as well. So it's a dangerous combination. You've got capability and opportunity both shooting up. So that's one that I'm definitely keeping an eye on this year. So with I suppose the one topic that's probably on everyone's mind, and I can't seem to find a report that doesn't reference it nowadays, which is, you probably know exactly what it is. Risk and compliance. No, Gen AI. David, have you seen any good examples in industry right now of organizations that are actually finding tangible value from using Gen AI in security?
It's a really, really good question. And I get asked this a lot in a few different contexts. And I think we're still really figuring out what Gen AI can do for us. And there's a lot of talk about its use cases for evil in the security industry. And I'm not too sure if we've really started to sort of pivot that towards how we can be using it for good. And we're starting to see vendors and security providers dabble a little bit. And some of it is really, some of the capability we're seeing is really built off the LLMs that we all know and love. There are some interesting stuff that you can start to see there, some stuff where you can say, well, where am I vulnerable for this and that? And it's all still very conceptual right now. I think I'm still, and I don't know if you've seen anything different, Alice, but I'm still waiting to sort of see what's the real killer app for AI in the security space. Where is the product that is actually going to really do proper automatic remediation in real time and not after the fact?
Yeah, and I think I share that sentiment in the sense of it's, I agree, it is very early days. I've seen a few different demos of AI in action in security, and in an isolated demo, sometimes the promise of what's to come is really impressive. But I think we're definitely a while away from that. From a malicious perspective, though, Alice, I might throw to you. Are you seeing anything in this respect, in the sense of, from an intelligence perspective, what are threat actors doing with Gen AI?
At the moment, I would say that threat actors are using it almost the same way we're using it. They haven't found any great groundbreaking way to utilize it that we haven't, for example. So there's now Worm GPT, Fraud GPT, which is sort of your jailbroken chat GPTs, and they'll help threat actors write phishing emails and generate malicious code, which your normal chat GPT won't allow you to do to a certain extent. So we're seeing that kind of usage, which means that, yes, they're writing code probably a little bit quicker than what they used to, similar to corporate use of ChatGPT. And then we're also seeing them, probably the thing that's taking the most impact at the moment is the phishing emails are getting very good now that they can actually really fine-tune the languaging, make it really realistic, whereas before there might have been a few signs in the language that's used that it was something malicious or a bit suspicious. So that's probably the main things that we're seeing at the moment. What will happen in the future, who knows, but I'd say we're sort of matching as far as sort of the good guys' usage of it versus the bad guys, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd say that's exactly right. I was reading a research piece that came out of a university recently where they were specifically looking at the challenges of using most LLMs nowadays. They have guardrails in place. You go on ChatGPT and ask it to do bad things, and it doesn't. Sometimes it does, and you can get around it, but it's hard. So guardrails make it much harder, which is great, to stop bad stuff happening. But what that means is there are more and more, it's called now LLMs as a service. And this goes back to what we saw coming last year, where I thought ransomware as a service was going to be much bigger than it is. But now LLMs as a service seem to be pretty big. And this university, after a very brief period of actually looking hard, found 14 that were highly effective in their words. So these are malicious LLMs that do things like Worm GPT and Fraud GPT. They do malicious stuff, and what was really interesting to me was when we look at risk when it comes to exploits, vulnerabilities, that barrier of entry, and why I was always worried about ransomware of a service was because it didn't require a high level of skills to do that. Now, when I look at a good example of AI in action, there was recently a startup that was showing how they could solve more than 80% of their engineering workflow with AI now. And they can write everything end to end. And you sort of start applying this to the malicious lens, and you think, okay, well, that barrier of entry is definitely going to be dipping, and it already is. So to me, it's going, okay, well, this is getting more tangible. So with that, I think, so that there was 14 LLMs that were for sale that were highly effective, but there were over 100 that you had to pay for, but they were just completely unguarded. So these are just LLMs that have no guardrails at all. They're not necessarily malicious, but I mean, why else are you going to use it in order to do bad stuff? So that's definitely an insight. I don't want to call it a prediction because I don't want to sit here in a year's time saying I got it wrong, but I'll do it. It's definitely going to be, I think, a lot more prevalent anyways going forward. Is AI something that any of your teams are experimenting with internally in security? Alice?
Yeah, absolutely. Our threat intel team have really embraced it. That's sort of the important thing. When new technology comes along, you can't really ignore it. You need to actually really embrace it and understand it in order to better protect yourself. So we have very much been playing around with it from as soon as ChatGPT launched in December or Jan last year, over a year ago now anyway. We've been really playing around with it and figuring out how can it be used maliciously, but also how can we better use it to improve our workflows and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective anyways, I've seen most organizations in some capacity are trying to spin up their own AI ventures, and it's interesting because the level of effort and benefit varies greatly between organization to organization. So there's definitely that energy behind it, but it's looking for those good examples outside of Microsoft Security Copilot, which has got all the bells and whistles. But it's sort of looking for those smaller custom security solutions with AI.
That point as well, if I may, we've got sort of similar kind of dabbling in the same areas that you are, but it's also the rest of the organization and the different AIs that they're wanting to use in coding or even in marketing teams. And some of our focus has really been sort of guiding and helping the organization to make sure that AI is being used elsewhere in a way that is safe, and that they're using tools that can be trusted and that aren't shipping our data off to wherever to help their LLMs learn more as well. Because I think, to your point, everyone is building some form of AI into something. I was even typing a text message today and noticed an update on my phone. There was a little button there where I could improve the writing of my text message with AI. So it's literally everywhere.
Yeah. Soon you won't have to reply at all. You can just let your AIs talk to each other. Two examples that I can definitely talk to of seeing malicious AI in action. Our research arm published this report recently where they specifically looked at two campaigns that we're tracking. One of them was called Doppelganger, and this is a Russian state-sponsored campaign where they're using AI to produce disinformation content, specifically around election interference. And this was really interesting. There's stuff in wider context. There's something called sentiment analysis when you're trying to understand these shifts of public opinion. So there are ways you can carry this out to get an indication of how effective a campaign is. So what Russia are doing with Doppelganger is using AI to produce content, and they're training this model quite extensively. So their output now for disinformation, and especially as we're moving into the election interference sort of side of things, starting out to get pretty concerning. The second one was Chinese disinformation campaigns as well. They pretty much along the same lines. They seem to have a lot more economic and market strategies with it, but it's in the wild, and it's being used. I think probably one of the more interesting ones that I saw recently was a organization in the Asia Pacific region that had a $25 million issue with AI, shall we say. And that was, I think they generated a bunch of deep fakes, videos of employees on the call, and faked, an entire call around this, and convinced someone to transfer $25 million. But what really stood out to me at the end of that was some of the assessments, and I think one came out of a university in the UK that said it only takes 15 minutes of 15 seconds of voice sampling to actually recreate deepfake. So that is quite terrifying, actually. So on that note, I guess the geopolitical outlook, looking back, 2, 3, 4 years ago, geopolitics wasn't necessarily something that was front and center when it came to security strategies. I remember back when I was in the bank anyways, it was definitely a consideration, but it wasn't primarily at the front, especially when it came to looking ahead with strategies. Alice, I know you spend a lot of your time as an enthusiast with geopolitics. So, what is your experience with, the prevalence of this in security right now?
Yeah, I think the past few years has really taught us that geopolitics and cybersecurity are not isolated. They are very much related. Geopolitical events are impacting, obviously, the behaviour of state-sponsored threat actors, but more so, increasingly more so, your cyber criminals, your hacktivists. This is something that everyone saw at the commencement of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We saw not only is there going to be state-sponsored activity, but there was a lot of cyber criminal groups pledging allegiance to either side. We had hacktivist groups were launching operations based on countries supporting either side of the conflict, and that trend has very much continued. And it showed that there is now an ability to influence not only public sector, that's always been the case, but private sector, banking, critical infrastructure, all that sort of thing. And this is going to continue, if not more so, over the next few years.
And David, at sort of your level, is there a geopolitical risk element specifically, that you consider when it comes to that overall risk posture? Is that still something that's growing? I mean, where are we with that?
Yeah, look, it's definitely always been on the radar, and I think we're having a lot more serious conversations about it this year with just the position of a few things that are happening around the world right now. There are some of the most divisive elections are happening this year, and that is going to have the potential to sort of spill over into Australia, and it's going to be an interesting one to watch and track and progress, because I think a lot of us have been probably more traditionally concerned with the smash and grab style cyber attack, the financially motivated, and have we really been, especially in the private sector, appropriately prepared for what, if Australia were to really be high on the radar? Because I think that you can get dissenting views on how interested nation-backed threat actors are in Australia. And I've seen a few graphs which actually show us pretty low down, but others show that we've increased in recent years. So I think we're just on the precipice of something much larger. What that is, hard to say.
And I think that's actually a fantastic point, actually. It is actually really difficult to sort of get an idea of the scale of the risk. In every direction you look, to your point, it's either Australia is very low down, specifically as a country, for example, but then you have internal reports recently published by one of our security agencies saying it's exceptionally high. So, and even if it is, then there's not a lot of advice as to what you can do about that, or what you should be looking at. So I think it's definitely, for me in the security industry, one of the bigger challenges in trying to understand, because for me personally, when you're trying to define how to deal with risk, first you need to be able to define what the risk is. So what is the risk? How can you measure it as an impact to your organization? And then number two, how can you find actions that you can actually measure and demonstrate a reduction in that risk? And for me, geopolitics, or risk around geopolitics, it's still something that I haven't seen a great way to handle that risk.
I think if you're thinking about that as a risk for your organisation, you've got to be asking yourself why. What benefit would there be for that risk to be fully realised for you? I think the SOCI Act is helping classify a lot of organisations in this space in terms of who is systems of national significance versus critical infrastructure, or whatever it may be, right? That is kind of helping the organisations that should be really preparing and putting that into their risk management plans more on the spot in that regards.
Yeah, completely. And I might actually ask if you could give a 2-minute overview of what that SOCI Act actually is for anyone that doesn't know here in Australia.
Yeah. For anyone in the room or watching online who hasn't heard it, it means for the Securing of Critical Infrastructure Act. So it largely, if you were to kind of look at it in terms of what is most commonly critical infrastructure, it's things like hospitals, it is things like energy providers, utilities, anything which if it were to come under attack or its resilience were to be impacted, could have an impact on the economy, on national security, or whatever it may be. So it was first, I remember when we first sort of started looking into it and what its applicability may be at PEXA and the impact it could have on us from a regulatory perspective. It was sort of largely a set of obligations around risk management and security that your organisation would meet, but it's starting to evolve much more beyond that into a full reporting regime that really is starting to, the aim is to raise the bar and create more transparency between government and these providers around what is happening in the security space.
And what did you find the reception to SOCI was in the community? I remember when it was first announced, my initial reaction, we mostly saw it coming, but it was sort of like, what was your perceived reaction in the community? Was it something that was quite well received, or?
Yeah, there was very much a curiosity. Like I said, we launched into, when we first knew it was coming a few years ago, we started looking at, well, how likely are we to be classified under this, and should we be classified under this? And there are probably a lot of people out there who are asking, okay, is this just another audit that I'm going to have to do or something like that? And I think a lot of the consultation process that was done with industry, which we participated in, was to make sure that it was not just more regulatory burden and that it created more of a culture of shared accountability, which actually uplifts the overall resilience for the Australian public.
Yeah, and I'd say that was a similar sentiment all around. For me, what's really interesting at the moment is looking at the SEC in the US. They've just mandated something very similar. Surprisingly, we actually got ahead of them for once when it comes to legislation in Australia. But the SEC just released expectations for critical infrastructure to report material incidents within 4 days. Their definition of, I think, a material incident is any kind of incident that would affect the decisions of shareholders. But for me, what's most interesting, it's like, yeah, okay, well, we've seen this and experienced a bit of it in Australia. But for me, what was particularly interesting around the atmosphere in the US was I can already see it creating better transparency. A specific example is Microsoft openly talking about some pretty serious security incidents recently. Not only did they choose to notify the SEC, but they published logs straight away. Who knows how much information they're giving, but the point is they're giving information. And I personally haven't seen that level of transparency that quickly before. I remember a few years ago when you would hear rumors of companies getting compromised, and it would stay rumors for days, if not weeks, before you would get a tagline of like a sentence going, there is an incident ongoing, and that's all the information we're releasing. And it's frustrating in the community because collective resilience and defense is something, and when you don't know it's an organization that has similar infrastructure to you, there could be information in there. So for me, I think there's already positive outcomes from this act. I haven't seen any examples that come to mind here specifically around that in that quickness, but I think one of the other things that stood out to me in the US was On the other side of the fence, it's like, well, how do you enforce something like this, and what are they doing to encourage the behavior? Maybe a bit draconian, but an example to me was recently the CISO for Uber, that it potentially could be on probation for 3 years and facing massive fines for covering up a data breach. So I think they're approaching both ends, going, here's what happens when you don't do this, and so Microsoft thinking, it's better to start creating this transparency.
Yeah, and I think, well, hopefully what we'll start seeing with SOC, and especially in some of the reforms that have just come out for consultation recently, is a more encouraged and incentivized environment to actually come out and start talking and working with government and industry about what is actually happening. Because I think with those timeframes around reporting, the clock starts ticking at an organisation when they first get the scent of what could be a cyber incident, and then everyone's in panic mode about what they're going to say once the 11th hour is hit. And the collective ecosystem resilience, I think, is something that's really, really important as well. Shane, you and I have talked about this before. Everyone's so panicked at the moment, especially since some of the big incidents we've had in this country, that whenever someone has a cyber incident, whether they sort of directly within your ecosystem or not, we treat them a little bit like they're someone who's just tested positive for COVID and it's 2020. And you're not allowed back out to play until you've produced your negative result, right? And there's a lot that gets in the way of being able to just have, honest discussions to say, well, this is what's actually going on, and this is what is potentially the risk to you, because we're so panicked about what we say and what that might mean legally and all that kind of stuff. So we've almost gone too far the other way, and we need to come back a little bit and find the sweet spot.
I completely agree with that. I think it's a really big challenge to overcome. That collective resilience piece goes a long way, even as an early warning system, which isn't happening as quick nowadays. And there are a number of initiatives from government and private sectors to try and accelerate this, but that's definitely an open challenge for sure, I think. Especially, I think, often you've got huge legal requirements in front of you which prevent you from doing this, but hopefully with the second SOC, it's going to start undoing some of that. I know here in Australia, we had CITES, I think it was, the Cyber Threat Intelligence Sharing Initiative from government, and the idea was, they would get all these organizations sharing intelligence centrally with the idea of growing that collective resilience, but I think it's a lot harder to do in reality than come up with the idea. So when it comes to initiatives like CTIS and others, Alice, I might ask you, because it kind of revolves around, collective resilience sits a lot with the other end of the scale, which is third-party risk. On one hand, you can sort of work together with your third parties and vendors and peers, and that's a harder, longer road. But then on the other hand, it's managing third and fourth party risk. And having spoken about all the vulnerabilities and the targeting and everything getting more and more and more, is this a space where you see risk growing as well? Have you noticed more attention on third party risk over the last year?
Absolutely. Last year we had, I think, the CLOP exploitation of the Move It file transfer platform was the big one. There was thousands of victims, and the likelihood for most organisations was if you weren't impacted directly by that, a third party was. So there is that huge focus now on how do we even scope this, what's our response, and from the flip side as well, if you're an organisation and you're impacted, what's your response then to your third parties and to your customers? So it's definitely a problem that a lot of organisations are looking at, a lot of intel teams looking at, a lot of third-party risk teams are looking at, but it's going to be increasingly hard to solve as more organisations get impacted. Exactly, by that CLOP vulnerability I just mentioned.
Is there a sort of a best practice in the industry right now when it comes to managing third-party risk? How do you sort of even begin to approach that? Because where do you start? If you're a large organization anyways, it's very difficult to map even who your third parties are.
The key thing would be when you're onboarding your third parties is to make sure you really understand their security approach and what your assessments are of them before you actually allow them to be custodians of your data or have access to your systems. That's probably the number one thing, and then to continuously review that. But that's by no means a panacea for the third party problem. I'd be interested to know actually what your team would be saying. You guys are the experts. Help us solve the problem.
I don't think anyone has solved it properly yet, but there's a lot of work that goes into managing third-party risk. From our end, we facilitate a lot of monitoring for third and fourth parties, but some really interesting use cases recently from some of the orgs I've been working with is they've actually directly given their procurement team access to their threat intelligence tools specifically for just doing third-party exposure checks. How many credentials are available online for this organization right now? What's their attack surface like? But again, could be legal challenges in even doing those checks. So there's some out-of-the-box thinking, put it that way. That was the first time I'd actually come across that idea, and I thought it seemed so obvious when you think about it, having procurement with the tools to do that. But that could be very resource heavy when you throw that to an Intel or a SOC team to go, okay, all onboarding, you guys have to do these checks now. You're taking them away from incidents, and that prioritization starts to drop. So I don't think there's an easy solution in that space. One thing I found really interesting, again, from 2023 is there were 2 times the number of software supply chain attacks in 2023 than all other years combined. So software supply chain attacks are, skyrocketing in popularity because it's sort of a one-to-many approach. You hit one supplier and then you've got access to many different organizations. So we're definitely seeing threat actors pivoting towards this, and it comes down to something called BPO, which is business process outsourcing. A lot of companies are doing this more and more. Currently, it's a $260 billion a year market. This is expected to grow to $560 billion just in the next year. This is outsourcing things like support requests, development, even legal and HR. So BPOs are being targeted a hell of a lot more. So when we just look at the mentions and the targets going on, it's at least 2 times, again, to all the years combined. So threat actors are definitely figuring out this is a good place to hit. The challenge we have is, unfortunately, like I just said with the growth factor, it's becoming more and more efficient to use BPOs. A lot of companies primarily nowadays, we're talking large globals here, outsource to different geographies where it's much cheaper on labor costs, for example. So the use of BPO is on the rise, and unfortunately so is the risk. So I think again, don't call it a prediction here because I don't want to be wrong next year, but we will definitely be seeing, I think, BPO risk being discussed wider at an executive audience than it is now, because it's not something that factors into widely when they're talking about business efficiency decisions. I think one of the examples that I was really interested in, I made note of it, was Scattered Spider with their SIM swapping. They were targeting BPOs that were specifically directly connected into telecommunications companies, targeting what they call crypto whales, and taking over massive wallets from BPOs. And it's something that's just sort of blown up. Yeah, that was just a really interesting one. I think we've sort of almost on time for Q&As, but the last little thing I'd like to touch on actually was something that's making it a little bit harder to even detect threat actors in our environment, which is this trend that's definitely picked up in 2023 of using legitimate services to hide, especially with network traffic. So using legitimate services like Google Drive, OneDrive, connecting to C2s under that keeps them under the radar. So for me personally, TTPs are definitely shifting, and it's something that is becoming a little bit trickier to sort of manage. I don't know, Alice, have you sort of had any of those observations with your TTP mapping in ANZ, or is that something you're still sort of considering on the horizon?
Yeah, it definitely highlights the importance of analysts really having a really good understanding of the threat actors and the activity that's out there, and shifting away from that reactive in that, yes, it's already hit, to that proactive posture of, okay, well, this is what could hit and we're already protected. So it's making sure that your analysts are really, or your threat intelligence teams or defenders have a really good understanding of what threat actors are doing, who they're targeting, and how they're actually doing it. And then closing the loop on that. It's like, okay, well, we've got that information now. How do we actually action it and make sure that we're protected? So it's writing your custom detections, it's your threat hunts, it's all of that proactive stuff to ensure that you're already sort of understanding what could happen before it actually does. That would be the key thing. And then at more of that macro level, it's that strategic lens as well. It's looking at those high level trends and then sort of figuring out the applicability for you as well.
Definitely, and that's something that I feel very strongly about. It's something that, you know, I took away from my time in government, you know, kept doing in my time in banking, which was always focusing on that proactive approach. A little fun fact I always like to share with the efficiencies around proactivity, and it's a question I usually ask people, is if we look at reactive strategies, threat hunting, or hunting in general, I usually ask the question, you know, what is the most successful hunter in the animal kingdom? And I won't put anyone on the spot, but most people usually go with, you know, I don't know, a big cat like a lion, or someone wanted a bear, and I was like, yeah, okay, I can see that. But it's big cats catch around 40% of their prey, and they're actually some of the most efficient hunters around. But the most efficient hunter in the animal kingdom is actually a dragonfly, and captures almost 98% of its prey. And it's very different. It doesn't actually chase its prey. Dragonflies analyze their targets and intercept it. So they don't chase prey, they predict where they're going to be. And that's always been my mentality coming out of government, was you've got a much higher success rate of preventing things going wrong when you can intercept your targets. So exactly to your point, which was putting proactive detection rules in your environment, getting in front of the threat actor instead of behind, is definitely the only way to sort of stand a chance in this increasing environment. Most of the facts and figures that I spoke about today were actually published in the 2023 review report from INSICT. So if anyone is wanting to fact check me, please go and check the report. And yeah, I think we've got time for some Q&As.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There's 2 questions here, and we implore people to please send some more through the Q&A, and then we'll pass over to in-house questions here. The first one is, we all know that China and Russia are financially motivated in attacking financial institutions. Are we seeing much of that in Australia/New Zealand?
I think everyone is, especially in the West, everyone is talking more about it. Whether or not we're seeing more when we say China and Russia, we could be talking about financially motivated crime groups or state-sponsored. And traditionally, it's mostly your financially motivated crime groups that are going to be doing, you know, those attacks. Just looking at exploitation over the last year, yes, it's obvious that everything's gone up in that respect. But specifically on financial institutes, there isn't an explicit narrative that would, you know, say that. I think recently, both Gartner and INSICT published a report specifically around the risk to financial industry right now, so they're worth a read as well to dig out some of the fun facts there.
Excellent. What's the best way of making your organisation mature in its threat intelligence? Most organisations leave this until something happens. What are some good preemptive steps we can take to mature our management?
I might throw that to you, Alice. Yeah, that's
So I'd say there's a few things. So a lot of organisations will sort of start with sort of that quick fix of threat intel, which is setting up a TIPS or threat intel platform, bringing in IOCs, so indicators of compromise, and voila, we've got a threat intel team or service. But it's The sign of a really mature capability is going all the way up to the strategic, which is very much that umbrella layer that speaks to your senior leadership and is actually able to translate the risk all the way up. So a key thing would be to understand your audience and who you're talking to when you're starting to build up your threat intelligence capability. If you want to connect with your senior leadership, particularly outside of technology, do not use technical jargon. Translate the risk in a way that they'll understand and that they'll actually appreciate. And also the other key thing there is really understanding what is relevant for that audience. What do they actually need to know? Because the thing is, with threat intel, we are all really passionate and we all really love it, and we all could talk about it with our colleagues all the time. But you can't saturate your leadership, or else you're just going to be this constant feed that people will stop listening to. So it's being really clear and articulate with your communication and being very precise on when you actually do communicate it, and that will actually get leadership to start listening. But it's definitely a slow burn. I would say it's one of those things where you just sort of start from the ground up. You start with looking at your indicators of compromise. You start then looking at some threat actors. You make sure that you're communicating every now and then with leadership, and slowly that will start to snowball and gain traction. But I'd be interested to hear, David or Shane, what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, I like your point around how you make that understandable to the rest of the business and outside of technology, so they understand the risk. And it's really important for us that we do give them a bit of perspective into what we're looking at and what we're analysing. But you limit it to what are your 3, maybe 4 like leading and lagging indicators of threat. And that also gets you kind of questioning a little bit too. Oh, cool, we're seeing more on the WAF here, whatever it could be. And then we pivot as well to the controls, which are designed to combat those threats, the key controls, because there are lots of them. And that can be really hard for security teams and technical people to figure out, well, I'm like, all of them are important, so I should be reporting on all of them. I know you've got to think of what are the key ones that are actually, going to mean something if they're failing, whether it be your endpoint agent compliance or whatever it might be. And keep that trending, keep them looking at it, get them used to, what is background noise versus, what is actually a sign that you could be getting targeted, and that, or a particular area of the business is getting targeted, whatever it might be. Because I've found in experience, the more you give them that understandable information, that gives them a bit of technical insight as well, just enough. Like the thirstier they get for it, and the more buy-in and the more investment you get into what you're doing as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think me having a sort of government lens, we really took the term intelligence back down to its fundamental principles, which is what is intelligence. When we talk about how do we set up a good intelligence team, whether it's a cyber threat intelligence team or any kind of intelligence, at a principle level, intelligence is simply data plus context, right? Context is the key point to getting intel right. So what that means in reality is if you can understand the difference between a threat and a risk, that's effectively along the right way. Not every threat is a risk to you. So intel is effectively what helps you identify what the risks are out of those threats. Ultimately, your goal for threat intel should be about driving efficiencies, because that's when you're doing it well, that's effectively what it does.
Another one has just come through. You mentioned Linux vulnerabilities a lot before. How can organizations who use AWS/GCP ensure that their gold image is compliant and / or not vulnerable?
I would say you might want to have a look at the manual that comes along with those, but that might take a while. There's someone, look, I'm not an expert in cloud infrastructure, so I don't want to butcher INSIC's report on this. But just purely from the reality of the environment, it is growing bigger with our push to virtualization and cloud in general, where you're looking at a lot of Unix. It is a risk, especially because there's this sort of dance that's going on at the moment as to, well, who's ultimately responsible for my security of cloud? Is it the host, or is it me? And it's sort of a bit of a back and forth. So I think there's still a long way to go in cloud maturity. I've yet to see any examples of large orgs doing it exceptionally well. There's a lot of orgs that are taking good approaches to it. This is where things like defense in depth and zero trust come into play. And for me, some of the biggest advantages to mitigating cloud risks are passwordless, keychains and that sort of thing. So going passwordless seems to be one of the easier, I'll say easier, it's actually very difficult, one of the more desirable ways to mitigating some of those risks.
If I may as well, if you're talking, the question was specifically talking about keeping either the golden image or whatever the AMI is in AWS, secure and vulnerability free. Unfortunately, the latter doesn't exist, not in my experience anyway. But you've got to just consider if that golden image or base AMI is your crown jewels, then what are your key controls that are protecting it, right? So, what are your access controls like? How are you monitoring it? How are you segmenting it? All of that, combined is what's going to make that a more resilient part of your environment. Use privileged access managers if you've got the capability to do so. Don't have static administrator access into AWS and your CLI and all that kind of thing. Leverage a cloud posture security tool if you can, right? There's just, you mentioned that the layers of controls, right? There's no, it's a good question. There's no silver bullet. You've really got to look at holistically at your environment and how you're protecting it.
I agree.
We have another question that has just come through, but I might pass to the room to see if anyone has any questions. I'll pass you this microphone. Speak into it.
I think in part you've already answered this when we've spoken about strategic intelligence, specifically about building that appetite of decision makers to gradually become more interested in a particular threat from a long-term perspective. But I'm interested to hear your reflections on how you build that in government specifically, where you're subject to election cycles and very much what the political class are interested in at the time, how you start to build some of that longitudinal thinking about what some of the existential risks may start to look like as they get closer to a tipping point.
That is a very good question and a very difficult one to answer because there's so many layers to that. Ultimately, when it comes to strategic intelligence, and look, part of my role in government was briefing Parliament on complex intelligence issues as well, and it was always a challenge for us because you can't ever make whatever you have to deliver understandable to 100% of your audience. It's very difficult. I mean, realistically, you should be aiming for about 20%. That's a realistic saturation point for information or intelligence sharing. And it's identifying who the key decision makers are when it comes to the critical information. Who are those influential people that should be aware of this risk because they're the ones that are actually going to have to make tough calls on that. So when you understand where the risk sits at a decision maker level, it lets you understand how you can adjust your narrative. Trying to create one narrative that fits all is very difficult. There are ways to do it, but driving general interest, I might throw it to you, Alice, and you can talk through, something during my time in ANZ I saw grow to really interesting levels was a weekly threat report. And, well, actually, I'll let you talk to that quickly.
Yes, so that was something that the threat intelligence team produced and still do produce every week. It goes across the entire bank from our frontline bankers all the way up to C-suite. And that was bringing in stories, intelligence events that were current that week and translating them to in a really simple way so that everyone can understand them regardless of their background and how it actually specifically applies to the bank. So you had very clear, the what, and then very clear the why are we talking about this. And that has been a really huge win for us. It's really helped everyone get a really good understanding of why it actually matters, and it's helped sort of embed that approach.
Yeah, and that sort of, the point behind that was making the information accessible to everyone and hopefully driving interest at a wider level, because when people start talking about it more at a group level, people start understanding it more at a leadership level. So there's a lot of strategies in that one. Could probably write a book on that. Not a very good one, but yeah. I think we're almost, one more question? Yeah?
I might have trouble articulating this properly, but we always talk about threat intelligence as getting ahead of problems and layered defense in depth, layered security. We rarely talk about when stuff happens. Do you guys have any strategies or thoughts of building in threat intelligence, or how we deal with the sort of BCP and crisis management end of things? When things happen, how can we pull in what we know to help our resilience and recovering from when it happens? We never want to get there. We always plan around that, but we've seen all the events that have happened recently. How, as larger organisations, complex organisations, and AWS golden images and all the stuff that we don't really have good answers for, is anyone actually talking about how to deal with it when it happens?
Actually, no.
I was going to say, what I'm sort of thinking as you're going through that question there is, what is the value that threat intelligence offers, when the proverbial hits the fan? And when dealing, in my experience, when you're dealing with, maybe an IOC that's been triggered, or, you've got that, security expert smell that tells you something's not right, or you are dealing with a crisis, whatever it might be, your threat intelligence and the information that you have available to you can actually help you understand what you might be dealing with. And if you've got good threat intelligence set up, you can go, oh, actually, based on the IOCs or the patterns of information we're seeing, this is actually attributed to this group who was motivated by this, who uses these TTPs, which can then help potentially inform your security analysts and your incident responders on how to go about containment. And from a CISO perspective as well, it also helps me brief the crisis management teams and the CEO and everyone who's very interested in what's going on, because they're probably going to be asking, why? Who is this? Why are they doing it? And can I set the hounds on them? So I'd be interested, Alice, because what's your sort of thoughts on how you deal with that in the moment?
I think a good way to sort of prepare yourself for the what if and how threat intel can plug into that is doing sort of your tabletop exercising, all of that sort of thing. So actually playing out, okay, if we had this cyber attack, what would be the steps? And that's a great way to showcase how threat intel can very quickly plug into an incident if it was to happen. So that's sort of from more your preparing perspective, I suppose. But it's going to be exactly as you said, we're there to enrich what's happening and to provide that additional context so that, okay, well, if we're seeing this, we might be also seeing X, Y, Z, and then this is where we can support. So it's sort of that in the moment stuff, but then also actually getting a really good understanding of what it can bring should it happen, so that there's that really clear workflow.
And I think what you touched on is context is really important with during an incident. There are threat actors that primarily just send ransom notes saying, oh, we're in your environment, give us, with no evidence. And if you check the IOCs and go, actually, this is, infrastructure from a legitimate threat group, then it might shift your perspective on the risk. So context is risk, and that's ultimately, what it comes down to. But very quickly, it's intelligence-led red teaming and tabletop exercising. They're the only ways you can actually test your BCP processes to see what happens to them under pressure. Cool, I think that's at time. So thank you very much for everyone who joined us online and here in the room. And thank you very much, David and Alice, for taking time out of your days to come and have this discussion.
Very welcome, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was great.
Cheers.
Thank you.